So I want you to just imagine the world economy back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. Just picture it as this massive, unstoppable conveyor belt. And as Europe industrialized, this belt just started cranking up to maximum speed.
Oh, yeah, it was moving fast.
Exactly. On one end, it's just churning out an endless supply of cheap factory-made goods. And on the other end, it's frantically sucking up raw materials from the rest of the world just to feed those European factories.
Right, which was a pretty brutal setup for anyone not in Europe.
It really was. For most developing nations at the time, getting caught on that conveyor belt meant total economic devastation. Like, it meant total deindustrialization.
Basically crushing their local economies.
Yeah, their local factories, their artisans, just completely wiped out by this global machine.
It was a massive transition for much of the world, and that's exactly what we're getting into today. We're looking at a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research that highlights this incredible historical anomaly.
Which is just fascinating.
It really is. The paper is called Globalization, De-industrialization, and Mexican Exceptionalism 1750 to 1879, and it's by researchers Debato Gonzalez, Gomez Galvariato, and Jeffrey G. Williamson.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack how one specific country managed to, somehow jam the gears of that giant conveyor belt. How do they actually keep their domestic industries alive?
And we are talking about Mexico here.
Yes, Mexico. And the craziest part of this research, like the real counterintuitive hook, is that Mexico survived the Industrial Revolution precisely by missing out on a massive global economic boom.
Which sounds completely backward.
Totally backward.
Error.
So we're going to explore how silver, the price of corn, and political independence created this bizarre shield around Mexican manufacturing.
But to really grasp the magnitude of what Mexico survived, we have to look at the sheer scale of the global economic tsunami that was hitting the developing world at the time.
Right, because between 1750 and 1913, the whole global economy was essentially being rewired. Okay, so looking at the sources, I'm trying to piece together how this tsunami actually formed. So you have Europe, right, specifically Britain, shifting away from strict mercantilism.
Where they basically hoarded everything.
Right, they hoarded everything, but then they opened up to free trade. And at the exact same time, you have this massive transport revolution.
Steamships, railways, all of that.
Yeah, which suddenly makes it infinitely cheaper and faster to move goods across oceans. So if I'm putting this together, Europe's booming factories suddenly have the political will and the physical technology to create this massive vacuum.
Just sucking up raw materials from everywhere else.
Exactly.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. The industrial core in Europe just had this insatiable demand for cotton, rubber, metals, luxury goods, whatever could fuel their factories.
Right.
And this created what economists call a historic terms of trade boom for the periphery. So countries in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East.
So their stuff got way more valuable.
Right. Suddenly, the raw materials they were exporting became incredibly valuable on the global market, while the manufactured goods they were importing from Europe got much, much cheaper.
But wait, I need to stop you there. Because on paper, that sounds like a universally fantastic thing, right?
You'd think so, yeah.
Like, if I'm getting paid way higher prices for the stuff I export,
right,
and I'm paying way less for the stuff I import, I'm getting richer. How does getting rich off your raw materials actually ruin your own industry?
It totally sounds like a dream scenario, I know. But it actually triggers a very dangerous, well-documented economic trap. It's called Dutch disease.
Dutch disease. Oh.
Yeah, the term actually comes from the Netherlands in the 1950s when they discovered natural gas, but the mechanism itself is timeless. What happens is, when a country's primary raw export becomes overwhelmingly valuable, it completely warps the domestic economy.
Because everyone just chases the money.
Exactly. Capital and labor just follow the money. They completely abandon local manufacturing to go after those massive immediate profits in the raw materials sector. Ah, okay. I get it. It's kind of like a small town where a massive, incredibly lucrative gold mine opens up, right? But at the exact same time, a cheap mega retailer moves in next door.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, so everyone in town quits their jobs at the local furniture shops and clothing stores to go work in the gold mine because it pays double.
Natural.
And since they have all this gold mine cash, they just buy everything they need from the cheap mega retailer. So the local shops are starved of workers and customers, and they just go completely out of business.
Yes, and to add a layer to that analogy, it's not just the workers leaving, it's the town's investors, too.
Oh, true.
I mean, why would a local banker give a loan to a struggling furniture shop when they could just invest in the gold mine for a guaranteed massive return?
They wouldn't.
Exactly. So Dutch disease inflates local costs, wages get driven up artificially by the export boom, and domestic factories are just starved of capital. They simply cannot compete with the cheap imports flooding in. Man, that brings so much clarity to the data in this paper, because the numbers are absolutely staggering. The researchers show that between 1800 and 1860, per capita industrialization in the developing periphery fell by 67%.
Which is just a massive collapse.
A total collapse. And if you look at the Ottoman Empire, by the 1870s, their domestic textile supply had dropped to just 11 to 38% of local consumption.
Everything else was imported.
Right. And in India, it fell to between 35 and 42%. The British essentially dismantled the legendary Indian textile industry.
It was just a wholesale hollowing out of domestic production across the globe.
But then we look at Mexico.
Yeah.
And by 1879, domestic Mexican producers still claimed a whopping 60% of the local market.
They really held the line.
They did. And they did this while going through absolute domestic hell. Like, things were not good there.
No, not at all. And that is exactly what makes this exceptionalism so baffling to economic historians. Mexico was not enjoying some golden era of peaceful prosperity.
Right, they had a war.
Yeah, they suffered catastrophic economic disruption. You had the insurgencia, their war of independence against Spain, which devastated infrastructure. Mines were flooded, workforces were scattered all over the place.
Just total chaos.
And then following independence, they entered what historians actually call the 5 lost decades.
Lost decades.
Yeah, basically zero GDP growth between 1820 and 1870. The country was fractured by political instability and local warlords.
It's like a ship sailing into a massive hurricane. It completely loses its sails, meaning it has zero economic growth, and it's just getting battered by the waves. But somehow, the hull of the ship is perfectly sealed.
Right.
So while all the other ships in the ocean are taking on water and sinking to the bottom, this one just bobs along on the surface, surviving. So, I mean, what was that sealed hull? How did they survive?
Well, the researchers identify 3 specific interconnected pillars of Mexican exceptionalism.
Okay, what are they?
The first is weaker terms of trade shocks. The second is wage competitiveness, which was tied tightly to local food prices. And the third is pro-industrial government policies.
All right, let's unpack Pillar 1, the Silver Shield. To survive the raw material boom, Mexico basically benefited from missing the party entirely.
Exactly. We really have to look at what Mexico was actually exporting. Their foreign trade mix was highly open, but it was incredibly singular.
Like they only traded one thing.
Pretty much. For the most part, Mexico's global trade was a one-for-one exchange. They exported silver to import textiles.
Wait, I'm a little tripped up by that. Silver is quite literally money. How does an economy function when its primary export is it's just currency?
It's a really great distinction to make. In a system backed by precious metals, silver was the global currency, yes. But for Mexico, it was a commodity. They were physically mining it from the earth.
Oh, I see.
But because silver was the global monetary standard, its price dynamics behaved very differently than something like raw cotton or rubber. While other countries saw the prices of their raw exports completely skyrocket during this boom.
Yeah, the paper notes that Latin America overall saw a 1.4% annual increase in their terms of trade from the 1820s to 1850s. And Egypt saw a massive 2.7% annual increase.
Right, huge jumps. But the price of silver on the global market stayed relatively flat. It didn't experience that massive artificial boom.
So the gold mine, in my earlier analogy, it just never really opened in Mexico.
Basically, yeah.
Because their main export didn't suddenly become insanely valuable. They just avoided Dutch disease. Their investors and laborers weren't completely sucked out of the local textile industry to go chase a massive export boom.
That's the first crucial element, exactly. Because their external terms of trade didn't rise dramatically before the 1850s, local manufacturing wasn't choked out by an overvalued export sector.
Okay, that makes sense. A flat export market actually kept them grounded.
It prevented the broader economy from being distorted by sudden, massive wealth in one single area.
Right. But surviving globalization isn't just about avoiding a boom. I mean, Mexican factory owners still had to physically produce goods and pay their workers without going bankrupt against those cheap British imports.
Which brings us to Pillar 2.
Yes, and this is where the paper introduced a concept that frankly made my eyes glaze over at first. The neo-Ricardian economic model.
I know, it sounds like really dense textbook jargon.
It does.
But it's actually a brilliant lens for understanding how societies functioned before modern industrialization. The model is named after the classical economist David Ricardo.
Okay.
And in simple terms, it explains how a non-tradable good something, heavy and perishable, that is produced and consumed locally, like corn or maize, completely dictates the survival of a tradable good, like a textile blanket.
So walk me through what that actually looks like for a factory worker in, say, 1830s Mexico. Why does the factory owner care so much about the price of corn?
Because in a pre-industrial economy, workers are living on what we call subsistence wages. They aren't saving for a mortgage, they aren't buying luxury goods.
Right.
They are spending the vast majority of their daily wages on pure calories just to survive to the next shift.
Wow.
So if agricultural productivity drops and there's a bad harvest, the local price of corn spikes. And if corn spikes, workers literally cannot buy enough calories to live unless their employer pays them a higher nominal wage.
Oh, I see. And if you are a factory owner making cotton blankets,
Yeah.
and you are suddenly forced to pay your workers 20% more just to keep them from starving, the cost of making your blanket goes up.
Precisely.
Suddenly you take that blanket to the market, and it's way more expensive than the cheap British blanket that just arrived on a steamship.
Yeah.
So you go out of business.
That is exactly the fatal mechanism that destroyed India's industry.
Really?
Yeah. In India during this time, their agricultural sector suffered a massive collapse. Food prices spiked dramatically, wages were forced up just to keep pace with starvation, and their textile industry, now saddled with high labor costs, was just decimated by British imports.
That is so wild.
But in Mexico, something entirely different happened. Despite all the political chaos we talked about, their agricultural productivity held relatively steady. They were very, very good at growing corn.
So if you're listening to this and trying to map it to today, think of it kind of like city rent. If rent, or in this case a bushel of corn, is cheap, you don't need a massive inflated salary just to live in the city.
That's a very accurate modern equivalent.
Because the cost of living in Mexico stayed manageable, the local textile mill could afford to pay you a living wage, keep their production costs low, and still price their blankets competitively against the British.
And the data the researchers pulled proves this out beautifully. They show that after 1800, the relative price of textiles fell faster in England than it did in Mexico.
Wait, how is that possible? Weren't the British the ones with the crazy new industrial technology making everything cheaper?
They were, but England's food prices were rising faster than Mexico's, which drove up British labor costs. Furthermore, Mexican wages actually fell quite steeply right before their independence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this combination stable food prices and falling nominal wages kept Mexican labor costs highly competitive on a global scale.
That is fascinating.
It emphasizes a really profound point. Your internal domestic conditions, like how efficiently your farmers grow crops, are just as critical to surviving global trade as your international tariffs.
Okay, so you've got stable silver, keeping the broader economy from warping, and you've got stable corn, keeping local labor competitive.
Yeah.
But even with all of that, cheap British textiles were still a massive existential threat.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to Pillar 3, the power of policy autonomy. Mexico had a final defense mechanism that colonized nations simply didn't have. They were politically independent.
Independence is the absolute linchpin here. Because Mexico had fought for and won its sovereignty, it had the autonomy to set its own trade rules. India couldn't throw up a tariff against Britain.
Because they were ruled by them.
Exactly. But Mexico could. Now, early on in the 1820s, Mexico mostly used tariffs just to generate basic revenue for their newly formed government, not really to protect factories, but that changed quickly due to public pressure.
Yeah, the sources highlight this incredible historical moment. In 1828, there was massive social unrest in the city of Puebla. Thousands of textile artisans basically rioted.
They were facing total ruin from imported British calicos.
Right, so they took to the streets demanding the government intervene. And because it was a young, fragile republic that desperately needed stability, the government actually listened. In 1829, they completely banned the import of inexpensive cotton textiles.
It was a drastic measure, for sure. But they didn't just stop at bans. The government realized that protecting outdated artisans wasn't a long-term strategy.
They had to modernize.
Yes. So in 1830, under the guidance of a prominent statesman named Lucas Alamán, they established the Banco de Avío.
Okay, you have to explain how this bank actually functioned.
Okay.
Because running a national development bank in a post-war country with zero GDP growth sounds impossible. Where did the money even come from?
It was incredibly clever, actually. The Banco de Avío was entirely funded by the revenues the government was collecting from tariffs on other imported goods.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they took a slice of the customs duties and used that capital to provide loans to domestic entrepreneurs. But these loans weren't just cash handouts.
What were they?
The bank was often physically buying modern, mechanized spinning jennies and looms from abroad, importing them, and then leasing them to local Mexican factories to kickstart their industrialization.
That is brilliant. And the results of this are just wild to read. By 1843, thanks to this state-sponsored jumpstart, Mexico had 59 mechanized mills operating over 100,000 spindles.
It was a massive leap.
It really was. To put that in perspective, Brazil, which is another massive Latin American economy, didn't even have 8 mills until a full decade later. Mexico was heavily outpacing its peers.
It was a highly deliberate, state-sponsored leap into the industrial age, driven entirely by political autonomy.
But I have to push back here for a second, because if you talk to almost any modern economist, they will tell you that throwing up massive bans on imports and heavily subsidizing local business is a terrible idea.
Oh, for sure. They argue it usually just protects lazy, inefficient industries.
Right. It removes the competition that forces them to innovate. And the paper notes that a wave of liberal politicians took over Mexico in the 1850s and pushed for free trade. So didn't dropping those protections completely crush these sheltered factories?
You're totally right that overprotection often breeds inefficiency, and that was exactly the fear when the liberals took power. But the paper reveals this brilliant, almost sneaky twist in how those 1850s liberal tariff reforms actually worked in practice.
Ooh, what did they do?
Well, in 1856, the liberals did indeed lower the protective tariffs on imported finished cloth, exposing Mexican factories to more foreign competition. But crucially, they also removed the strict bans on importing raw cotton.
Okay, I'm missing the connection there. Why does the ban on raw cotton matter so much if they are trying to make finished blankets?
Because raw cotton made up between 48 and 72% of a textile mill's entire operating cost.
Wow, that's huge.
It was their biggest expense. Before 1856, Mexican mills were forced to buy locally grown Mexican cotton, which was expensive and sometimes in short supply. By allowing factories to import much cheaper raw cotton from places like the U.S., the government actually slashed the overall production costs for domestic mills by up to 35%.
Oh, wow. So even though the finished blanket had less tariff protection at the border, the raw materials to make that blanket were suddenly so much cheaper that the factory's profit margins remained entirely safe.
Exactly.
They basically just shifted the protection from the finished product directly to the supply chain. That is incredibly savvy policymaking.
It really was. It maintained a very high rate of what we call effective protection, ensuring the factory survived the transition to a more liberalized trade environment.
Okay, so let's step back and summarize this incredible survival story for everyone listening. Mexico weathered the great global de-industrialization tsunami because of a totally unique trifecta.
Right.
First, a steady silver market that prevented their economy from warping under Dutch disease. Second, a stable, locally sourced corn supply that kept the cost of living low, meaning their labor costs stayed fiercely competitive. And third, the political freedom to both aggressively protect and cleverly modernize its factories through things like the Banco de Avío and those strategic tariff reforms.
Spot on. And if we pull back to look at the broader implications, this research completely disrupts the traditional narrative of globalization. It proves that participating in global trade is not a one-size-fits-all destiny. Your specific local conditions, like the nature of your primary export, the agricultural productivity feeding your workers, and your political autonomy to dictate your own trade terms, those factors entirely decide whether a wave of globalization acts as a rising tide that lifts your economy or a tsunami that wipes it out.
That's a super powerful framework for looking at how nations develop. But there is one final, mind-bending historical irony that the researchers drop right at the end of this paper. And I think it's the perfect provocative thought to leave you all with today.
Oh, the 1890s collapse.
So we've just spent this entire time talking about how stable terms of trade, the fact that silver didn't spike or crash saved Mexico.
Mhm.
But in the 1890s, Mexico's terms of trade finally did collapse.
They really did. Global silver prices plummeted dramatically toward the end of the century. Suddenly, the purchasing power of Mexico's primary export on the world stage was just slashed.
Right. And according to all the economic logic we usually hear, a massive collapse in the value of your main export should just ruin you. It is a severe systemic disadvantage.
Definitely.
Yet the paper shows that this exact moment of global disadvantage is what triggered Mexico's true industrial liftoff.
Yeah.
The size of their textile industry doubled rapidly right after this collapse, right before the 1910 revolution.
It seems entirely contradictory until you look at the underlying mechanisms of capital flow.
Right, because suddenly the silver mines weren't profitable anymore. So all that domestic capital, all those wealthy investors who were perfectly happy parking their money in silver for decades, suddenly panicked. They needed a new place to put their money to get a return.
So they pivoted.
Exactly. Capital flooded out of the export sector and poured directly into domestic manufacturing. And on top of that, because the silver peso depreciated so badly, foreign imported goods became astronomically expensive to buy in Mexico.
So the currency collapse essentially acted as a massive invisible tariff.
Yes, creating a protective wall around local factories without the government having to pass a single law.
It's a profound irony. The very event that devastated their international standing provided the exact domestic conditions, like abundant investment capital and a shielded local market necessary for a massive industrial expansion.
It really leaves you with a challenging question to mull over. Is a nation's true economic strength sometimes forged not when the global market heavily favors them, but when it actively turns against them?
Does being at a severe disadvantage globally actually force a kind of dangerous, innovative self-reliance that prosperity never could?
It challenges the very core of how we view economic success and failure on the global stage.
It really does.
It turns out, sometimes the only way to survive the conveyor belt isn't to ride it perfectly, but to be the one who knows exactly how to jam the gears when it matters most.